I built the lake house myself. Not with a contractor, not with a crew of strangers. I built it one board at a time. During the same summer, my daughter first learned how to swim. For nearly 3 decades, that little house on Lake Amelia wasn't simply a building to me. It was where my wife, Louise, laughed, where my children grew up, and where I thought our family would always have a place to come back to. I was wrong about that last part. My name is Walter Nash, but everyone calls me Walt. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years teaching woodshop at Cedar Hollow High, and over the years, I built porches, decks, sheds, and cabins all around the lake. But that house was different. Louise found the property back in 1996. A realtor named Beverly Coons took us down a muddy road outside Cedar Hollow, Michigan, to a half-acre piece of land most buyers ignored because the driveway flooded every spring. Louise stepped out of the car wearing her best shoes, looked across the water, and simply said, "This is the one." She was usually right. Louise was the kind of person who helped people without making them feel like they owed her anything. If a neighbor was struggling, she showed up. If someone needed groceries, somehow a bag appeared at their door. She even kept a small coffee can filled with emergency cash in our pantry. She called it Tuesday money. Her philosophy was simple. If somebody needed $20 and was too embarrassed to ask, you gave it to them. 2 years ago, I lost her to ovarian cancer. 11 months after the diagnosis, she was gone. Since then, the lake house has been the only place that has ever felt remotely peaceful. My son Kevin is 38. He works in commercial insurance in Grand Rapids. My daughter Renee is 34 and married to Todd, a man I never completely trusted. I loved both of my children, but I had made one mistake as a father. I gave them things instead of having difficult conversations with them. I paid bills. I helped with expenses. I assumed they understood what the house meant. I never sat them down and said, "This isn't an investment account. This is the place where your mother lived." Then came Saturday, June 6th. It was 9:14 at night. I was sitting near the dock with a glass of iced tea watching loons move across the dark water when my phone vibrated. It was Kevin, not a phone call, a text. I opened it. "We sold the lake house, Dad. You need to be out by Monday." I read those words again, then again. My daughter Renee sent another message moments later. "It's for the best, Dad. We already have a buyer. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I called Kevin. He answered after several rings. I could hear a television playing in the background. I asked him whose name was on the deed. There was a pause. Then he said, "Dad, you're 67. You're alone out there. It's 8 hours from us. It's not safe, and the offer is too good to pass up." Not once did either of them ask how I was doing. Not once did they ask what it felt like to wake up in the house where their mother had spent the last years of her life. They talked about closing dates, buyers, and money. Then Kevin ended the call. That was when something inside me finally shifted. Because my children believed they had already sold my lake house. They just didn't know what I had done 14 months earlier. And on Sunday morning, when I finally looked at the paperwork I'd hidden away, I realized their entire plan was about to collapse. But what happened next wasn't just going to stop a sale. It was going to reveal exactly why I'd made that decision in the first place. And by Monday morning, my children were going to discover that the house they thought belonged to them had already been promised to someone they never expected. That Sunday morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I kept thinking about one word. Sold. Something about it didn't make sense. Kevin and Renee couldn't sell the lake house, not anymore. 14 months earlier, I had changed everything. After Louise died, my hands started shaking. At first, I ignored it. Then one morning, I dropped a coffee mug. The next morning, it happened again. A doctor eventually told me I was showing early signs of Parkinson's disease. It wasn't an immediate crisis, but it was a warning. The doctor told me that I needed to plan ahead. So I did, quietly. I met with an estate attorney named Raymond Cole and explained what I wanted. I didn't want to lose the lake house while I was still alive. I wanted to remain there for the rest of my life. But I also wanted to make sure the property eventually went to people who actually understood what it represented. So I placed the house into a trust. I retained the right to live there for the rest of my life. But ownership itself was no longer simply sitting under my name. And my children were not the primary beneficiaries. That decision wasn't made because I hated Kevin or Renee. It wasn't revenge. It came from something Louise had told me before she died. During one of her final clear afternoons, she had looked at me and said something I'll never forget. She told me that when she was gone, I should pay attention to who kept showing up. Not who called when they needed something. Not who asked about money. Who showed up. Her niece Patricia had been there during Louise's final weeks. She helped with meals, stayed through difficult nights, and never expected anything in return. Another person who kept showing up was Earl Whitfield, my neighbor down the lake. Earl was 71, retired from the county road crew. He had watched over my property for years. If my mower sounded wrong, he'd appear with his toolbox. If a storm damaged something, Earl was already fixing it before I knew there was a problem. His granddaughter had spent almost every summer fishing from my dock, so I made a decision. The trust would protect my right to remain in the house. After me, the property would go to Patricia and Earl's granddaughter. I didn't tell Kevin. I didn't tell Renee. Part of me wanted to avoid another argument, but another part of me was still hoping my children would eventually understand what mattered. Then came Monday morning. At first, my phone barely made a sound. Then it started ringing. Kevin called, then Renee, then Kevin again. By late morning, I had missed call after missed call. By noon, there were dozens. I didn't answer. I sat outside and listened to the water. Eventually, Renee reached me. Her voice sounded completely different. "Dad, what did you do?" I asked what she meant. She said the title company had discovered the trust. The buyer's attorney had stopped the transaction. They couldn't legally sell something they didn't own. For the first time, my daughter realized that the house wasn't an asset waiting for them to cash out. It was protected, and they had no idea why. That evening, Kevin drove all the way from Grand Rapids. It was late when he finally arrived. He walked onto the porch with his headlights still shining behind him. I opened the door. We sat at the kitchen table Louise had bought years earlier. I made him coffee. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Kevin looked directly at me. "You could have told us." I nodded. "You're right," I said. Then I looked him in the eyes. "You could have asked me how I was doing before telling me I had until Monday to leave." That was the first time I saw something change in his face. Because suddenly, this wasn't about a house. It was about everything that had happened before that text. And Kevin was about to ask me a question that would force both of us to confront the past. Because the trust had stopped the sale. But it couldn't stop the truth from coming out. Kevin stared at me across the kitchen table. He wanted to know if there was any way to reverse the trust. I told him there wasn't. Not unless Patricia agreed. Not unless Earl's granddaughter's legal guardians agreed. And neither had any reason to give up something Louise had intentionally inspired me to protect. Kevin looked frustrated. So, that's it? He asked. The house just goes to people we barely know. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Patricia spent 6 weeks beside your mother, I said. Where were you during those 6 weeks? Kevin looked down. He didn't answer. That silence said more than an argument ever could. Eventually, he finished his coffee and left. He drove back toward Grand Rapids shortly after midnight. He never apologized that night. And maybe that's what hurt most. Not the attempted sale, not the money. The realization that my children had looked at the lake house and seen an opportunity. I had looked at it and seen Louise. There was a difference between those two things that neither of us could pretend away. Renee eventually reached out. Her apology wasn't dramatic. She left a card in my mailbox. She didn't make excuses. She simply acknowledged that what they had done was wrong. I kept that card, not because it erased everything, it didn't, but because it showed me that something had changed. After that, Renee started coming to the lake more often, and strangely, our conversations became smaller, but more genuine. She asked about Earl's granddaughter. She asked how Patricia was doing. She asked about the garden, the dock, and the old boat. Things that had nothing to do with money. Kevin was different. He started calling on birthdays. He still hasn't given me the apology I once thought I needed. But I've stopped waiting for it. That's another lesson I learned from Louise. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive because another person finally says the right words. Sometimes peace arrives when you stop needing them to. The lake house is still standing. The porch still faces the water. The dock still reaches into Lake Amelia. And some mornings, I sit there with my coffee and watch Earl's granddaughter cast her line into the same water where my children once learned to swim. I think about Louise. She never needed to shout to make people listen. She believed actions mattered more than promises. For years, I didn't understand that. I thought protecting my family meant giving them everything I could. But Louise taught me something near the end of her life. Giving someone everything doesn't always mean you're helping them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is draw a boundary. I didn't take the lake house away from my children. They were never entitled to it in the first place. What I protected was a piece of our family history. And I gave it to people who had demonstrated through their actions that they understood its value. That was what Louise had asked me to do. Pay attention to who keeps showing up, eh? So I did. And perhaps that was the real inheritance. Not the property, not the money. The lesson. If you've ever had to protect something meaningful from someone you expected to understand its value, you already know how complicated that choice can be. Sometimes family isn't defined by who shares your last name. Sometimes it's defined by who shows up when nobody's watching. And that's why I don't regret what I did. The house remains. The memories remain. And for the first time since Louise died, I can sit on that porch without wondering whether I made the wrong decision, because I finally understand what she meant. The lake house was never really about who would own it. It was about who would honor what happened there. And that was something no buyer could ever put a price on.